Chapter 1. Beorn the Black Bear. Beorn woke slowly, his body a heavy anchor, dragging him back to the battles of his past. The tent, damp and dim in the weak dawn light, felt like a cage. He shifted, feeling the coarse fur of the black bear's pelt against his skin. Even now it felt both comforting and oppressive, the heavy hide that marked him as the Black Bear, a name that had come to haunt him. Every scar beneath it bore a tale, a life taken, a friend fallen, a reminder that each day was a debt to a life he should have left on the battlefield long ago. Faint sounds of camp life began to stir through the canvas walls, soft and muted, the low murmur of voices, the crackle of kindling, the clang of armor buckles being fastened by calloused hands. The men were already awake, shaking off whatever nightmares had plagued them in the cold, mist-wrapped night. They had been here for 3 long, hard years, guarding this narrow, blood-soaked passage where the southern lands met the wild and ravaged north. Thangor's passage was a place of dread, a desolate stretch of mud and stone that had drunk its fill of blood, staining the land as surely as any river. "Lord Beorn," a voice called from outside, low and steady, though the hint of urgency behind it was unmistakable. "The dawn has come. You're needed." Beorn grunted, pushing himself upright. His body ached, muscles stiff from the chill and the ceaseless strain of war. He reached for his battered leather armor, the familiar weight of it easing the tension in his mind. His hand instinctively found the hilt of his sword beside him, a cold, unyielding comfort. He stepped out of the tent into a world cloaked in fog, the air thick with dampness. The cold bit into him, raw and unforgiving, as he took in the ghostly rows of tents stretching into the haze, their edges blurred by the fog that settled over the camp, like a funeral shroud. The fires, little more than ash and glowing embers, mingled with the familiar scents of sweat and smoke. The men moved quietly, their faces shadowed, weary, barely lifting their eyes from the ground. They were worn and hollowed by war, but they still strapped on their armor, fastened cloaks, and adjusted blades. Beorn's gaze drifted over to the black banner of the bear, its edges fluttering in the cold morning breeze. The green field beneath it faded and stained. His men looked to that banner for strength, a symbol of his iron will and unmatched tenacity. But Beorn himself could barely see that power in the cloth anymore. Its meaning weighed heavier in his mind than it once had. The Black Bear, they called him, a name he'd earned on a day soaked in blood and death. A day that had twisted his life into legend. Years ago, when the northern invaders had first breached their lands, Beorn had been, with only 20 men at a small town. The enemy poured in, 100 strong, their steel flashing under a sun dulled by smoke and dust. Outnumbered 5 to 1, his men had looked to him, fear in their eyes. But Beorn's answer had been a wild grin, a glint in his eye that spoke of something darker, something his men had never seen before. "Hold the line," he had told them, his voice low and calm, "and give them nothing but our fury." The battle that followed was chaos. He moved through the enemy like a force of nature, his sword carving paths through armor and flesh, his men rallying around him, fierce and unbreakable. But as the hours passed, one by one, they fell. 10 men, then 15, until only Beorn and 1 soldier named Auric remained, surrounded by bodies and drenched in blood. Reinforcements had finally arrived, cavalry charging across the plain in a thunder of hooves, but they halted at the sight that met them. In the center of the battlefield, Beorn stood over the last invader, his sword broken, his hands bloodied. He had resorted to his fists, beating the man senseless in a frenzy that terrified even his allies. He fought like a creature possessed, relentless and wild, a bear brought to life on 2 legs. When the enemy finally lay dead beneath him, he raised his blood-soaked hands to the stunned soldiers who had come too late to save his men. He was alone, victorious, with nothing left but a battlefield strewn with corpses. From that day on, they called him the Black Bear, a name born of the fear and awe he had instilled in every man who had witnessed that savage. He'd fought with a strength that seemed beyond mortal limits, a ferocity that had left even his own allies questioning if they had seen a man or a beast. But his was not the only banner here. Next to his own hung the king's, a golden lion on a blood-red field, proud and fierce, though it felt hollow and distant in this desolate place. The king sat far away, warm and safe, while his men lay on cold ground, with only death for company. Banners from other noble houses lined the camp, colours faded, frayed by war and weather, yet still they flew, symbols of loyalty that felt like chains. He thought of King Laenor, the lion, his friend and king. They shared a bond forged through battles and years of loyalty, yet for all they had in common, their differences often bred tension. Laenor was pragmatic and ruthless, willing to sacrifice whatever morality was needed for power and control, while Beorn's sense of honor and moral code remained unwavering. It was Beorn's loyalty that had him here. His loyalty to Laenor was a strength, but also a burden, a tether that kept him in this unending war. He fought for his king and friend, yet he clung to his own principles, a choice that had often brought them into conflict. Beorn's thoughts drifted to his home in Bear Creek. It was a place of beauty, where the land was rich, the pine trees tall and proud, and the creek ran clear and cold. His wife's face appeared in his mind, strong and fierce in her own way, with eyes that could soothe any worry or ignite a fire in him. He thought of her hands, calloused but gentle, hands that had tended both land and family with equal devotion, and their daughter, so young, but already fierce, with a spark in her eyes that reminded him of himself. He longed for them, longed for the simplicity of home, for the warmth that war had robbed him of. The young soldier who'd called him waited nearby, a boy of barely 18 summers, his face pale in the dawn's chill. "Lord Beorn," he said, keeping his voice low, "the scouts have returned. They bring news from the northern pass." A grim thought settled on Beorn's mind. The northern pass had been quiet for days, an ominous quiet that never boded well. War did not stay silent for long. With a nod, he gestured for the soldier to lead him. As they moved through the camp, men straightened when he passed, their faces lifting as though the sight of him brought them a fraction of the strength they sorely needed. He was their lord, their symbol, the man they fought for even as they wore the king's colors. Beorn was the Black Bear to them, a rock in a storm, and though he bore the weight of their respect, it felt heavier than any armor. When they reached the command tent, Beorn paused at the entrance, steeling himself against the weariness that gnawed at him. Inside, the tent was thick, with the scents of stale sweat, smoke, and steel. The wooden table, battered and scarred from years of maps and hard decisions, bore another set of hastily drawn lines, marking troop positions and fortifications. Small figurines represented his forces and those of the enemy, a grim array that told the story of an ongoing war and a dwindling hope. Sir Oric, his master-at-arms, awaited him inside, arms crossed, a severe expression lining his face. A soldier as old as Beorn himself, Oric had been at his side for countless campaigns. His eyes held the weight of battles won and men lost. With him was Lord Oswald and Lord Harrel. "My lord," Oryx said, giving a respectful nod. "The scouts returned not an hour ago. They bring troubling news." Beorn's eyes narrowed. "Of course it's bad news." His voice was as worn as the leather of his armor. Oryx gave a grim nod. "The force we sent forward, they didn't make it." Beorn gritted his teeth, a low growl forming in the back of his throat. "And the men, how are they holding up?" Oryx's expression darkened. "Poorly, my lord. We've had deserters slipping out into the night. Their numbers grow every evening. The men's spirits are frayed, and there's talk that more will flee if the tide doesn't turn." Beorn's expression darkened, though he kept his voice steady. "Fear can make even the strongest men falter. I can't blame them, not entirely." He paused, meeting Oryx's gaze, his own heavy with the weight of command. "But duty is duty. If we fail to discipline one, we risk losing control over them all." Oryx nodded, understanding the resolve in Beorn's gaze. Beorn's loyalty was unshakable, but he knew the cost of losing order, especially here on the edge of survival. "Have you spoken to my sons?" Beorn's voice softened, though the edge of command was still there. Oryx's expression shifted, careful now. "Not yet, my lord. Corey remains occupied." Beorn felt his irritation flare. Corey, his youngest, the one who found distraction in any comfort he could scrape. Even now, in the shadow of death, Corey hid away, a thorn in Beorn's heart. "Bring him here," Beorn ordered, his voice cold. "He'll learn his place, or I'll make him feel it. And Boris?" Oryx's look softened. "He's with the men, my lord, speaking to them. They respect him. But he too feels the weight." Beorn felt a flicker of pride at that. Boris, his rock, the steadfast one. Boris knew his duty, and though the war had drained them all, he stood firm where Corey wavered. It was men like Boris that kept hope alive. "Good," Beorn murmured. "Bring Corey and Boris here." He placed a hand on Oryx's shoulder, a brief moment of solidarity, a gesture forged from years of trust and unspoken battles. Their shared glance was one of understanding, a wordless exchange that spoke of loyalty and the unyielding weight of command. Outside, the mist was thickening, swallowing the camp whole. To Beorn it felt as though the world was closing in, pressing them all toward an end he could not yet see. But there, beneath the heavy fog and dark skies, Beorn knew the road was set. The only path left was to face whatever horror awaited over Thangor's passage. Thank you for tuning in to Realm of Ruins. Don't forget to like and follow to keep the story going.